The photograph sat in a manila folder buried among thousands of declassified documents in the National Archives. Black and white, grainy, shocking. A large American soldier in a blood-stained uniform towering over a kneeling Japanese woman, his hands gripping her traditional kimono, as fabric tears away from her body. Her face is contorted in anguish, tears streaming down her cheeks. Other soldiers watch from the periphery. One holds a camera. For 33 years, this image remains sealed in classified military files. When historian Dr. Margaret Fleming discovered it in 1978, her first thought was that she had stumbled upon evidence of a war crime. The composition suggested violence, violation, an abuse of power so blatant that even wartime could not excuse it. But Dr. Fleming was trained to look beyond first impressions. She read the accompanying documentation, medical notes, witness statements, a timeline that reconstructed every moment of June 15, 1945. And slowly and possibly the truth revealed itself. This photograph, which appeared to capture humanity at its worst, actually documented humanity at its absolute best. The torn dress was not an act of cruelty, it was an act of mercy so profound that it would echo across 8 decades, touching thousands of lives and changing how we understand compassion in the crucible of war. But to understand that moment, we must first meet the two people whose lives collided on that sweltering June day in Okinawa. An Iowa farm boy who carried his mother's Bible into battle, and a Japanese nurse who had been taught that Americans were monsters. Their story begins not with violence, but with letters from home. Camp Hansen prisoner of war facility sprawled across the southern end of Okinawa like a temporary scar on land that had seen too much blood. June 14, 1945. The Battle of Okinawa had concluded just 2 weeks earlier, leaving over 100,000 Japanese military casualties and forcing thousands of civilians and soldiers into American custody. The camp was hastily constructed, overcrowded, and stretched the resources of the occupying forces beyond their limits. Sergeant Thomas Bishop sat on an empty ammunition crate outside the supply tent reading a letter that had taken 6 weeks to reach him from Cedar Rapids, Iowa. The paper was worn soft from being folded and unfolded, carried in his pocket over his heart. The handwriting was his mother's, each word carefully formed in the penmanship of a woman who had completed 8 grades of schooling and considered proper writing a mark of respectability. Tommy, the letter began. She was the only person who still called him that. Spring planting is done. Ruth and I managed most of it ourselves, though Mr. Peterson from the next farm helped with the heavy equipment. The cows are healthy and we got good prices for milk this month. Tom closed his eyes, picturing the farm. Red barn that needed painting. The cornfields stretching toward the horizon. His sister Ruth, 19, now probably wearing their mother's old work boots because she refused to spend money on herself. They were keeping the place running without him. Without his father, who had died in a tractor accident in 1941, leaving Martha Bishop a widow at 50, with a farm to maintain and 2 children to raise. That accident was why Tom had enlisted. Military pay was regular. It meant his mother and sister could hire help during harvest. It meant they could keep the land his grandfather had homesteaded. It meant Ruth might even go to teacher's college like she wanted. But it also meant 3 years in the Pacific Theater. 3 years of watching good men die in ways that made no sense. 3 years of becoming someone his mother might not recognize. I pray for you every night, son. Remember what I told you before you left. War will try to turn you into something you are not. Do not let it. Stay the good boy I raised. Come home to us with your soul intact. Tom felt the weight of those words. Soul intact. Was that even possible after Guadalcanal? After Saipan? After Okinawa? His best friend Carl Henderson had died at Saipan, stepped on a mine that was meant for Tom. They had been walking patrol together. Carl was 3 steps ahead. Tom heard the click, saw Carl's face register what was about to happen. Carl had looked back at him and said, "Take care of my ma, Tommy. Tell her I wasn't scared." Then the explosion. Tom had written that letter to Carl's mother. He had lied and said it was quick that Carl hadn't suffered. He had lied and said Carl had been brave. Truth was, Carl had been terrified. They all were. But what else could Tom write that her son had died screaming, that Tom had held him while his life bled out into Saipan's volcanic sand? Some truths were too heavy to share. Tom smiled despite himself. The promise of that homecoming meal, Real food, home cooking, the taste of a life before war. It was something worth surviving for. All my love, Mama. Tom folded the letter carefully and returned it to his pocket. He was 27 years old, 6'2", 210 pounds of muscle built from farm work and military training. His hands were permanently calloused dirt embedded under his fingernails no matter how hard he scrubbed. A shrapnel scar ran across his right forearm from Saipan. His face carried lines that belonged to a much older man. But when he read his mother's letters, he was still Tommy, the boy who had chased chickens around the yard, who had fallen asleep in the hayloft reading dime novels, who had cried when his father died and thought the world would never make sense again. The war had tried to turn him into something else, something harder, something capable of killing without hesitation. And it had succeeded at least partially. Tom was a good soldier. He followed orders. He did his duty. But his mother's voice in those letters kept reminding him that duty was not the same as righteousness, that following orders was not the same as doing what was right, that being a good soldier and being a good man were sometimes two different things. Tom looked toward the prisoner compound. Hundreds of Japanese prisoners moved behind the chain-link fences topped with barbed wire. Soldiers, civilians, women, children, old men, all of them caught in the machinery of a war they probably never wanted. He watched an elderly Japanese woman share her meager rice ration with a young girl, perhaps her granddaughter. The gesture was so simple, so human, that it cut through all the propaganda and training. These were not faceless enemies. They were people, people who loved their families, who wrote letters, who worried about the ones they had left behind. Tomorrow, some of these prisoners would be processed for repatriation. Some would remain in custody. Some would die here, far from home, buried in foreign soil alongside the enemies who had killed them. And Tom, he would eventually go home to Iowa, to his mother and sister, to the farm and the cornfields and Sunday dinners. But would he still be the good boy his mother was praying for? Or had the war already taken that from him? He did not know, and that uncertainty was heavier than any equipment he carried. In the women's section of the prisoner compound, Yuki Nakamura sat in the shade of a canvas tent, trying to focus on a damaged medical textbook. The book had survived the battle that had killed her father. She had hidden it in her belongings when American forces overran the field hospital where she had been working. It was one of the few things she had managed to keep. The pages were water-stained and torn, but the information was still legible. Surgical procedures, anatomy, treatment protocols. Yuki had been studying medicine since she was 16 years old, taught by her father, Dr. Takeshi Nakamura. He had been a civilian physician in Naha, Okinawa's capital, before the war. He had dreamed that his daughter would attend medical school in Tokyo, something almost unheard of for women. But he had believed in her intelligence and dedication. Now her father was dead, killed in an American bombing raid in April. Her mother was dead. Her younger brother Kenji, only 17, had been drafted into the Imperial Army and was presumed dead. Yuki was 24 years old and completely alone in the world. She had been a nurse in a field hospital, treating wounded Japanese soldiers, and occasionally captured American soldiers who required medical attention. She had treated both with equal care because that was what her father had taught her. A patient is a patient. Suffering does not have a nationality. When American forces overran the hospital on May 22nd, Yuki had expected to be killed. She had been taught that Americans were devils, that they tortured prisoners, that they raped women and murdered children, that death was preferable to capture. But 3 weeks in American custody had contradicted everything she had been told. The Americans gave prisoners adequate food. Rice, canned vegetables, sometimes canned meat. It was not luxurious, but it was regular and sufficient. No one was starving, there was no torture, no systematic cruelty. Guards were stern, but not brutal. They followed regulations that seemed to prioritize basic human dignity. And yesterday, Yuki had witnessed something that shattered her understanding completely. She had watched an American guard, a young man barely out of his teens, give his ration cookie to an elderly Japanese woman who was struggling with hunger. He had done it quietly without seeking recognition or reward. He had simply seen suffering and had acted to relieve it. This was not the behavior of devils. This was not the behavior of an enemy committed to extermination. Yuki did not understand. The propaganda had been so certain, so absolute. Americans were monsters who would make prisoners suffer. But the reality was different. Not perfect, not comfortable, but fundamentally decent. It created a cognitive dissonance that Yuki struggled to resolve. Had her own government lied to her? Or was this camp an exception? Were these particular Americans unusual in their humanity? She had no answers, only questions that grew heavier each day. That evening as the sun set over Okinawa, Yuki felt a dull ache in her lower right abdomen. She tried to ignore it. Probably bad food, probably stress. The human body reacted to trauma in unpredictable ways, but by morning the ache had sharpened into pain. Persistent, localized, familiar. Yuki had enough medical training to recognize the symptoms. Appendicitis, early stage but progressing. Without treatment, the timeline was predictable. 24 to 48 hours before the appendix ruptured, then peritonitis, then sepsis, then death within 3 to 5 days. She needed surgery, immediately. But how could she communicate this to her captors? The guards did not speak Japanese. She knew only a handful of English words, mostly medical terminology. And even if she could make them understand, would they care? Would they waste precious medical resources on an enemy prisoner? Yuki pressed her hand against the source of pain and felt fear settle into her bones. She was going to die here, alone, far from home, in a prisoner of war camp where no one would mourn her, unless she found a way to make someone understand. Nurse Ellen Cooper had been in the Pacific Theater for 2 years, moving from island to island, treating wounded Marines and soldiers under conditions that would have seemed impossible back home in Georgia. At 31, she had developed a reputation for fierce competence and unexpected compassion. She had seen enough death to understand its inevitability, but she fought against it anyway because that was what nurses did. Ellen had lost her fiancé at Pearl Harbor. Robert had been a young naval officer stationed on the USS Arizona. When the Japanese attacked on December 7, 1941, Robert had died in the initial explosion. His body was never recovered. He was entombed with over 1,000 other sailors in the wreckage that still sat at the bottom of Pearl Harbor. Ellen had enlisted the day after his funeral, not for revenge, not for hatred, but because she understood that war created suffering on all sides and someone needed to be there to alleviate it. Medical care did not take sides. Pain did not recognize nationality. And Ellen believed deeply that healing was a calling that transcended politics. She was Baptist, raised in a small church outside Atlanta where her father had been a deacon. She carried a small Bible in her pocket right next to her medical scissors. She prayed every morning and every evening, and she prayed over her patients regardless of their uniform or language. War had not shaken her faith. If anything, it had strengthened it. When everything else failed, when medicine could not save a life, and bullets kept finding young men's bodies, faith was what remained. Faith that God saw suffering, that mercy mattered, that small acts of kindness accumulated into something larger than the machinery of war. On the morning of June 15, 1945, Ellen was conducting her daily health inspection of the women's section of the prisoner compound. This was routine work. Check for signs of malnutrition, monitor for disease, ensure that medical conditions did not go untreated. The Geneva Convention required adequate medical care for prisoners, and Ellen took those requirements seriously. She noticed a young Japanese woman doubled over near one of the tents, her face-pale sweat soaking through her clothing despite the shade. The woman was clutching her abdomen, breathing in short, shallow gasps. Ellen immediately shifted into clinical mode. She knelt beside the woman and spoke slowly in halting Japanese. She had picked up basic medical phrases from working with interpreters. Doko ga itai desu ka? Where does it hurt? The woman looked up at her, and Ellen saw intelligence in those eyes. Not the blank resignation of someone defeated, but the sharp awareness of someone who understood exactly what was happening to her body. The woman pointed to her lower right abdomen and managed to say in careful English, appendix, surgery, or die. Ellen's blood ran cold. She understood immediately. Appendicitis was a death sentence without surgical intervention. And this woman, whoever she was, had enough medical knowledge to self-diagnose. Ellen placed her hand on the woman's forehead. Fever, significant. Then she gently palpated the lower right quadrant of the abdomen. When she pressed down, the woman showed moderate discomfort. But when Ellen released the pressure, suddenly the woman screamed. Rebound tenderness, the classic sign of acute appendicitis. Ellen checked the woman's pulse. Rapid, 110 beats per minute. She pulled out her pen light and checked the woman's eyes. Pupils reactive, but the woman was clearly in significant pain. This was a medical emergency. Without surgery, this woman would die. Not quickly, not mercifully. She would die slowly over several days as her appendix ruptured, spilling bacteria throughout her abdominal cavity, overwhelming her immune system, and shutting down her organs one by one. Ellen stood up, her mind already racing through the logistics. They had a surgical tent. They had basic equipment. Lieutenant Hartwell was a trained surgeon. They could do this. But would Captain Crane approve? Would he authorize the use of precious medical supplies on an enemy prisoner? Ellen did not know. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She had taken an oath. She had promised to care for the sick and injured. And that oath did not include exceptions for nationality. She ran to find Lieutenant David Hartwell, her boots kicking up dust as she moved through the camp. The sun was climbing higher and the heat was already oppressive. Every minute mattered. Every hour brought this woman closer to death. Ellen found Hartwell in the medical tent treating an American soldier with an infected wound. The soldier's forearm was swollen and red, and Hartwell was carefully cleaning the infection with precious antiseptic solution. "Lieutenant," Ellen said urgently, "we have an emergency. Japanese prisoner, acute appendicitis. I estimate 12 to 18 hours before rupture." Hartwell looked up from his work, his expression shifting immediately from concentration to concern. He was 35 years old, a surgeon from Boston who had volunteered after Pearl Harbor. He had spent 3 years making impossible decisions, triaging patients under combat conditions, choosing who would receive limited resources and who would have to wait. The ethical weight of those decisions had aged him. His hair was graying at the temples. His hands, though steady during procedures, trembled slightly when he was not working. He carried the ghosts of every patient he could not save. But David Hartwell had one guiding principle that kept him sane: the Hippocratic Oath. First, do no harm, treat the sick, save lives whenever possible. That oath was his compass in a war that constantly tried to make him lose direction. "Show me," he said to Ellen, setting down his instruments. They walked quickly to where Yuki still sat, now barely able to hold herself upright. Hartwell knelt beside her and spoke slowly. "I am a doctor. I am going to examine you. Please tell me where it hurts." Yuki understood enough English to nod. She pointed to her lower right abdomen again. Hartwell performed the same examination Ellen had done. Palpation, rebound tenderness test. The woman screamed when he released pressure suddenly. Hartwell checked her temperature with a thermometer. 39 degrees Celsius, 102 degrees Fahrenheit. He stood up and looked at his watch. It was 10:30 in the morning. "Acute appendicitis," he confirmed. "Advanced stage. I would estimate 12 hours maximum before rupture, possibly less. Once it ruptures, she has maybe 3 days before sepsis kills her." Ellen nodded. "Can we operate?" Hartwell's jaw tightened. "Medically, yes, we have the capability. Politically, that is a different question." They both knew what he meant. Captain Richard Crane ran this camp with rigid adherence to regulations. He interpreted the Geneva Convention literally. Prisoners received adequate food, water, and shelter according to minimum standards. Nothing more, nothing less. Crane was 42 years old, a career officer who had lost his son Benjamin at Pearl Harbor. Benjamin had been 19 years old, a bright kid who had enlisted to serve his country. He had been killed in the first wave of the Japanese attack. His body never recovered. Richard Crane had never forgiven. Never would. He saw every Japanese prisoner as complicit in his son's death. He provided them the minimum required by law, but he would never waste resources on enemy combatants. Hartwell knew this. Ellen knew this. But they also knew that some decisions transcended military hierarchy. "I will talk to Captain Crane," Hartwell said. "In the meantime, get her comfortable. Give her water. Monitor her vital signs every 30 minutes. Ellen nodded and returned to Yuki's side. She helped the young woman lie down on a blanket in the shade, adjusting a rolled jacket under her head as a makeshift pillow. Yuki looked at Ellen with eyes that were beginning to glaze with pain and fever. She whispered something in Japanese that Ellen did not understand, but the tone was universal. A plea, a prayer. "Please help me. Please do not let me die." Ellen took Yuki's hand and squeezed gently. She spoke in English, knowing Yuki probably could not understand the words, but hoping she would understand the tone. "We are going to try to help you. Hold on. Just hold on. Then Ellen did something that felt as natural as breathing. She bowed her head and prayed, out loud, in English, knowing that Yuki could not understand the words but trusting that God heard all languages. Lord, we have a young woman here who is suffering. Guide our hands. Give us wisdom. Help us to save her life. She is your child, just as we all are. In Jesus' name, amen. When Ellen looked up, she saw tears streaming down Yuki's face. Not from pain, from something else. Confusion, perhaps. Or hope. Or the recognition that these enemies were praying for her. Yuki did not understand the words, but she understood the gesture. And for the first time since her capture, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps she might survive this day. Perhaps these Americans were not the monsters she had been taught to fear. Perhaps they were something else entirely. Lieutenant David Hartwell stood outside Captain Crane's office, gathering his thoughts. This conversation would require precision. Crane responded to regulations, to documentation, to arguments grounded in military law. He did not respond to emotional appeals or humanitarian rhetoric. Hartwell knocked once and entered. Crane sat behind a makeshift desk constructed from ammunition crates, reviewing supply requisitions with the focused intensity of a man who believed that proper paperwork could impose order on chaos. Captain Hartwell began, "We have a medical emergency. Japanese prisoner, female approximately 24 years old. Acute appendicitis. Without surgical intervention, she will die within the next 24 to 48 hours. Crane did not look up from his paperwork. "Give her aspirin." "Sir, aspirin will not treat appendicitis. She needs surgery." Now Crane looked up, his expression cold. "She is an enemy combatant, Lieutenant. We are not a hospital for the people who killed our soldiers. Sir, she is a prisoner of war. Under the Geneva Convention, we are required to provide adequate medical care." Crane set down his pen with deliberate precision. "Adequate medical care, Lieutenant. Not exceptional care. We give them food, water, shelter. We treat minor infections. We do not perform major surgeries that consume precious resources we need for our own men." Hartwell kept his voice steady. "Sir, if we allow a prisoner to die from a treatable condition when we have the capability to intervene and the International Red Cross investigates, you will face a court-martial for willful negligence resulting in prisoner death." The silence that followed was heavy with calculation. Crane stood slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Are you threatening me, Lieutenant?" "No, sir. I am protecting you. If this prisoner survives because we provided appropriate medical care, you are a commander who upheld humanitarian standards under difficult conditions. If she dies unnecessarily, you are a war criminal." Crane stared at Hartwell for a long moment. The calculation was visible in his eyes, weighing risk, considering consequences, measuring the cost of action against the cost of inaction. Finally, he spoke. "You have permission to operate, but I want everything documented, photographs, witness statements, medical notes, every step of the procedure. If this goes wrong, if there are any complications, if this becomes a problem, it is your responsibility, not mine." "Understood, sir. And one more thing, Lieutenant." Crane's voice was hard. "No morphine. We need it for our boys. Use local anesthetic only." Hartwell felt his stomach drop. Surgery with only local anesthetic meant the patient would be conscious. She would feel pain. Significant pain. It would be nearly unbearable. "Sir, that will cause extreme suffering." "That is an order, Lieutenant." Hartwell held Crane's gaze for a moment longer, then nodded. "Yes, sir." He left the office with authorization to save a life, and orders that would make that salvation as painful as possible. It was typical of war. Nothing was clean. Nothing was simple. Even mercy came with cruelty attached. But authorization was authorization. They would operate. They would save this woman's life, and they would deal with the consequences of how they saved it afterward. By noon, the medical tent had been transformed into a makeshift operating theater. Nurse Ellen Cooper worked with practiced efficiency, laying out surgical instruments on a cloth that had been boiled and dried to achieve something approaching sterility. Scalpels, retractors, hemostats, sutures. Each tool represented both possibility and limitation. They had the equipment to perform surgery, but nothing extra. No room for error. No backup supplies if something went wrong. Lieutenant Hartwell scrubbed his hands and forearms with harsh soap and precious antiseptic solution. The ritual was familiar grounding. In Boston before the war, he had performed appendectomies in clean, well-lit operating rooms with trained staff and unlimited resources. This was different. This was medicine stripped down to its essence. Skill, knowledge, determination, and hope that those three things would be enough. Private Daniel Reeves stood in the corner of the tent checking his camera equipment with nervous hands. At 21 years old, he was the youngest member of the team. He had been assigned to Camp Hansen only 4 days earlier, fresh from stateside training, still carrying the idealism that combat veterans had long since abandoned. His job was documentation, official military photography, recording events for the historical record. But Reeves understood that what he documented today would carry weight beyond mere record-keeping. The photographs he took would either protect everyone involved or destroy them. Context would be everything. A single image taken from the wrong angle without explanation could appear to show something terrible when the reality was something entirely different. He had loaded his camera with fresh film. He had cleaned the lens. He had positioned himself where he would have clear sight lines without interfering with the medical team. And he had prayed quietly that he would have the courage to document the truth, whatever that truth turned out to be. Sergeant Tom Bishop arrived last, summoned from his patrol duties with minimal explanation. When he entered the medical tent and saw the preparations, he understood immediately that something significant was about to happen, something that required witnesses. Hartwell turned to face him, his expression grave. "Sergeant, we are performing emergency surgery on a Japanese prisoner. I need you here as an official witness, and—" Hartwell paused, choosing his words carefully. "If the patient struggles during the procedure, I will need you to help restrain her." Tom felt cold understanding settle into his chest. "Restrain? Why would she struggle? We have minimal anesthesia. She will be conscious for portions of the surgery. She will feel pain, possibly extreme pain. If she moves at the wrong moment, I could sever an artery or puncture an organ. I need her absolutely still." Tom looked at the stretcher where a young Japanese woman lay, her face pale with pain and fear. She was small, perhaps 5'3", maybe 100 pounds. She looked younger than her years, vulnerable in a way that made Tom think of his sister Ruth. "You want me to hold down a woman while you cut her open and she screams?" Tom's voice was flat, but his hands had curled into fists at his sides. "I want you to help save her life," Hartwell replied quietly. "I know how this sounds. I know how it feels. But without your help, she dies. With your help, she has a chance." Tom thought about Carl Henderson dying at Saipan. He thought about his mother's letter still in his pocket over his heart. "Stay the good boy I raised. Come home with your soul intact." Was this what being good required, causing pain to prevent death, inflicting trauma to provide mercy? He did not know. But he understood that refusing would be cowardice dressed up as morality. Sometimes the right thing felt wrong. Sometimes mercy looked like violence. Sometimes being good meant getting your hands dirty. "I will do it," Tom said. Ellen brought Yuki into the tent on a stretcher, moving carefully to avoid jostling her. Yuki's eyes were half closed, her breathing shallow and rapid. The fever had climbed higher. Her body was fighting an infection it could not win against. Ellen had tried to explain what was about to happen using her limited Japanese and elaborate hand gestures. Surgery, pain, but life, survival, hope. She had held Yuki's hand and promised in words Yuki could not fully understand, but in a tone that transcended language that they were trying to help. Yuki understood enough. She was a nurse. She knew what appendicitis meant. She knew the timeline. She knew that without surgery, she would die slowly and painfully. She had seen soldiers die from ruptured appendixes in field hospitals. It was not a quick death. It was days of agony as infection consumed the body from within. So when the Americans moved her to the medical tent, when she saw the surgical instruments laid out, when she understood what they intended to do, she felt both terror and desperate hope. Terror at the pain that was coming. Hope that she might survive to see another day. But then she saw the big American soldier enter the tent. The one with the tired eyes and the broad shoulders. The one who looked like he could break her in half without effort. And she felt a spike of pure fear. Was this how she would die? Would they say it was surgery, but really it would be execution? Would this soldier be the last thing she saw? Tom positioned himself beside the stretcher, trying to make his presence less threatening. He caught Yuki's eyes and saw the fear there. He wished he could tell her that he was not a monster, that he did not want to hurt her, that everything about this situation made him feel sick. But they did not share a language. All he could offer was his expression. He tried to make his face gentle, reassuring. He hoped it worked. He suspected it did not. Ellen spoke to the team, her voice calm and professional. Lieutenant Hartwell will operate. I will assist. Private Reeves will document. Sergeant Bishop will provide security and patient restraint if necessary. We proceed with medical necessity as our guide and the Hippocratic Oath as our standard. Then she did something that surprised everyone. She asked, "May I pray, Wahao?" No one objected. This was war. Everyone had their rituals, their ways of coping with impossible situations. Ellen bowed her head. Tom, not religious but respectful of those who were, did the same. Even Reeves lowered his camera. Lord, we are about to do something difficult. Guide our hands. Give us steady nerves and clear minds. Help us save this young woman's life. She is your child, just as we are all your children. Let mercy prevail. In Jesus' name, amen. When Ellen opened her eyes, she saw that Yuki was watching her with an expression of confusion and something that might have been wonder. Prayer. These enemies were praying for her. Hartwell approached the stretcher and examined Yuki one final time. He pressed gently on her abdomen, feeling the rigidity, the guarding of muscles, the mass in the lower right quadrant. His diagnosis was confirmed. The appendix was inflamed and likely hours from rupture. He prepared the local anesthetic, a small vial of procaine that would numb the surgical site, but nothing more. It was not enough. It would never be enough. But it was all Captain Crane had authorized. Before administering the injection, Hartwell encountered a problem he should have anticipated, but somehow had not. Yuki wore a traditional kimono, a complex garment with multiple layers, intricate ties, and wrapping that served both practical and cultural purposes. The kimono was dirty and torn from weeks in the prisoner camp, but it was still her clothing, her dignity. Her last connection to the life she had known before war consumed everything. To perform surgery, Hartwell needed access to her lower abdomen, but he did not know how to remove a kimono properly. He did not understand the cultural significance of the garment or the profound humiliation that being undressed by male strangers would cause, and they did not have time for a careful, culturally appropriate disrobing. The appendix was on a timer. Every minute wasted was a minute closer to rupture. Hartwell made a decision that felt necessary and terrible in equal measure. We will have to cut it, just enough to expose the surgical site. He looked at Tom. Sergeant Bishop, I need you to do it. Tom stared at him. Why me? You are the surgeon. Because I need my hands free to operate the moment we have access. Nurse Cooper needs to assist me. Private Reeves needs to document. You have steady hands and the physical strength to make it quick and clean. Hartwell held out a pair of surgical scissors. Cut from the hem upward. Expose the lower right quadrant. Try to minimize the damage to her clothing. Be as respectful as possible given the circumstances. Tom took the scissors. They felt impossibly heavy, heavier than any rifle he had ever carried. He looked at Yuki lying on the stretcher, looking up at him with eyes that held terror and resignation. Ellen knelt beside Yuki and spoke in halting Japanese, trying to explain. They needed to cut her clothing. It was the only way. They were sorry. So sorry. Yuki understood. Her body went rigid. In Japanese culture, modesty was not just preference. It was identity. To be exposed to have her clothing removed by men was a violation that transcended the physical. It touched something fundamental about who she was. She wanted to refuse, wanted to scream that she would rather die than endure this humiliation. But she was also a pragmatist. She was a nurse who understood medical necessity, and she was a young woman who did not want to POW at 24 years old. So she closed her eyes and nodded. Permission, not consent. Surrender to necessity. Tom knelt beside the stretcher. His hand touched the fabric of the kimono, and he could feel Yuki trembling beneath it. He thought about his mother, about his sister, about every woman he had ever known who deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. And then he thought about the alternative, about Yuki dying in agony over the next several days because he had been too squeamish to do what needed to be done. He positioned the scissors at the hem of the kimono and looked up at Hartwell one last time. The doctor nodded. Tom cut. The sound of tearing fabric filled the tent. Loud, violent, wrong. Outside the tent, Japanese prisoners heard that sound and began shouting. They did not understand the context. They only heard a woman's clothing being torn. The implication was immediate and terrible. Guards moved to form a perimeter, preventing prisoners from approaching the medical tent. Voices rose in protest. Some prisoners were crying. Others were shouting accusations in Japanese that the guards could not understand, but whose meaning was unmistakable. Inside the tent, Yuki made a sound that was not quite a scream. It was deeper, more primal. The sound of someone whose dignity was being stripped away along with her clothing. Tom worked as quickly as he could, cutting upward along the seam, trying to expose only what was necessary. The kimono fell away, revealing Yuki's swollen abdomen. The skin was hot to the touch, stretched tight over the infection beneath. Reeves's camera shutter clicked. Once, twice, 3 times. The photographs captured the moment. A large American soldier, hands gripping torn fabric. A Japanese woman on a stretcher, face contorted with distress. Other soldiers watching. Out of context, the images looked exactly like what everyone feared they showed. Brutality, violation, the abuse of power. But Reeves was careful. He photographed from multiple angles. He captured Hartwell preparing instruments, Ellen adjusting surgical drapes, the medical setting, the clear evidence of emergency intervention. Context. The photographs needed context. Ellen moved immediately to preserve what modesty remained. She draped surgical sheets over Yuki's body, covering everything except the surgical site. The sheets were clean, stark white, professional. They transformed the moment from violation to medical procedure. Tom stood up, still holding the scissors, his hands shaking now that the action was complete. He felt soiled, guilty, as if he had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Yuki lay on the stretcher, tears streaming down her face, her body rigid with humiliation. She kept her eyes closed, unable to look at the men who had just stripped away her dignity. But Ellen took Yuki's hand and held it firmly. She spoke in Japanese words she had practiced. Daijobu, daijobu, anata wa enzen desu. It's okay, it's okay. You are safe. Yuki opened her eyes and looked at Ellen. The nurse's face held nothing but compassion. No judgment, no cruelty, just a professional determination to help. And slowly Yuki's breathing began to steady. Not because the humiliation was less, but because she understood finally and completely that these people were trying to save her life. Hartwell moved into position and began the surgery. He injected the local anesthetic in a circle around the surgical site, giving it 2 minutes to take effect. It would numb the immediate area. It would not eliminate pain. It would only make the pain bearable. Maybe. He made the first incision. Yuki screamed. The local anesthetic was not enough. Could never be enough. The scalpel cut through skin, and Yuki felt it as a line of fire across her abdomen. Her body convulsed, instinct demanding that she escape the source of pain. Tom placed his hands on her shoulders. Not brutally, not with excessive force, but firmly enough to keep her still. He leaned his weight into the restraint, preventing her from thrashing. "I am sorry," Tom whispered, even though she could not understand. "I am so sorry. You are going to live. I promise you are going to live. Please just hold still, please." The surgery proceeded with agonizing slowness. Hartwell worked through layers of tissue, skin, subcutaneous fat, muscle. Each layer required careful cutting. Each blood vessel needed to be clamped or cauterized. Each movement was calculated to minimize damage while achieving access. Blood welled up from the incision. Ellen dabbed it away with gauze, keeping the surgical field clear so Hartwell could see what he was doing. The smell of blood filled the tent, metallic and visceral. Yuki's screams had subsided to continuous moaning. She was crying without sound, tears streaming down her face, her body shaking under Tom's hands. Tom kept talking to her, meaningless words, comforting sounds. "You are doing so good. You are so brave. It is almost over. Just hold on. Just hold on a little longer." He had no idea if his words helped, but they helped him. They gave him something to do besides feel like a monster. Reeves continued documenting. His photographs captured the surgery in clinical detail. Hartwell's hands steady and precise. Ellen's assistants anticipating needs before they were voiced. Tom's position holding Yuki's shoulders. The clear evidence of medical procedure, not abuse. But Reeves's hands were shaking. His notebook, where he recorded timestamps and observations, showed handwriting that deteriorated as the surgery progressed. He had joined the military believing in truth and documentation. Now he was learning that some truths were harder to witness than others. Hartwell reached the peritoneal cavity and carefully opened it. He could see the appendix now, and what he saw made his blood run cold. "Christ," he muttered. The appendix was not just inflamed, it was gangrenous, black and swollen to nearly twice its normal size. The walls were beginning to break down, leaking purulent material into the surrounding tissue. They were perhaps an hour away from complete rupture, maybe less. "What is it?" Ellen asked, her voice steady despite the tension in her shoulders. "Gangrenous appendix. We caught it just in time. If this ruptures during removal, she dies on this table." Ellen nodded, understanding the stakes. "What do you need?" "Absolute stillness. And luck." Tom heard the exchange and tightened his grip slightly on Yuki's shoulders. She was barely conscious now, overwhelmed by pain and shock. Her moaning had become weaker, more distant, as if she was retreating inside herself to escape the agony. Hartwell began the delicate process of isolating the appendix from surrounding tissue. He had to work carefully, tying off blood vessels, separating adhesions, creating space to remove the infected organ without rupturing it. Each movement was slow, precise. Hartwell's forehead was covered with sweat despite the relative coolness of the tent. Ellen dabbed his face with a cloth between steps, keeping his vision clear. The tent was silent except for the sound of breathing, the occasional clink of metal instruments, and Yuki's soft moaning. Outside, the camp continued its daily routine, unaware that inside this canvas structure, a battle was being fought. Not with weapons, with skill and determination and the stubborn belief that life mattered more than politics. Hartwell positioned his instruments around the base of the appendix. This was the most dangerous moment, the extraction. If the organ ruptured now, bacteria would flood the abdominal cavity. Sepsis would be almost certain. Death would follow within days. He began to remove it, working with infinite care. The appendix resisted. Adhesions held it in place. The tissue was fragile, almost dissolving under pressure, then it began to tear. "Hold her absolutely still." Hartwell's voice was sharp with urgency. Yuki's body convulsed in response to a fresh wave of pain as Hartwell manipulated the infected tissue. Tom leaned his full weight onto her shoulders, pinning her to the stretcher as gently as he could while still maintaining control. "I am sorry, I am sorry, I am sorry," Tom repeated like a prayer or a penance. Hartwell managed to get the appendix out intact. Barely. He lifted the diseased organ with forceps and dropped it into a metal pan. It landed with a wet sound, black and grotesque, clearly hours from rupture. "Got it," Hartwell said, his voice thick with relief. "Now I close her up and hope to God infection does not set in." But before he could begin suturing, Yuki screamed, louder than before. A scream of pure agony that seemed to come from somewhere beyond human endurance. Ellen checked her watch. The local anesthetic has worn off completely. She is feeling everything now. Hartwell looked up, his face stricken. "I still have to close. I cannot leave the incision open. She will die from infection within days." "I know," Ellen said quietly. So Hartwell continued. He began suturing the peritoneum closed, then the muscle layer, then the fascia, working from the inside out. Each stitch required precision. Each movement caused Yuki pain that she could not escape. She was screaming continuously now. Not words, just raw sound. The sound of suffering that had exceeded the capacity for language. Tom was crying, tears streaming down his face as he held her shoulders, keeping her still enough for Hartwell to work. He kept talking, words tumbling out in English that she could not understand. "I am sorry. God, I am so sorry. You are going to live. You are going to survive this. This is saving you. I swear it is saving you. Please believe me. Please forgive me. You are going to be okay. You are going to go home. You are going to have a life. Please just hold on. Please." Ellen was crying, 2 tears falling onto her surgical gown as she assisted, but her hands remained steady. She passed instruments to Hartwell without hesitation. She maintained the sterile field. She did her job even as her heart broke for the young woman suffering before her. Only Hartwell's face remained impassive, not because he did not care, but because if he allowed himself to feel what he was doing, his hands would shake. And if his hands shook, he might make a mistake. And mistakes in surgery killed people. So he compartmentalized. He became pure technique, pure focus. He was not causing pain. He was closing an incision. He was preventing infection. He was saving a life. The surgery took another 20 minutes. 20 minutes that felt like hours. 20 minutes of Yuki screaming until her voice gave out and she could only make broken, gasping sounds. 20 minutes of Tom holding her whispering apologies. 20 minutes of Ellen assisting while praying silently. 20 minutes of Reeves documenting everything with photographs that would either vindicate or condemn them. Finally, Hartwell tied off the last suture. Done, it is done. He stepped back from the stretcher and his hands began to shake violently. All the tension, all the focus, all the suppressed emotion came flooding back now that precision was no longer required. Yuki had stopped making sounds. She had passed out, her body simply unable to endure consciousness any longer. Her face was pale, covered in sweat, streaked with tears, but her breathing was steady, strong. Tom released her shoulders and stumbled backward. He looked at his hands. They had left marks on Yuki's skin, red impressions where he had gripped her to keep her still, evidence of the force required to restrain someone fighting against unbearable pain. He turned and walked out of the tent before anyone could see him vomit. Ellen immediately moved to cover Yuki, properly adjusting sheets to preserve her modesty now that the medical necessity had passed. She checked Yuki's pulse, 105 beats per minute, elevated but strong and regular. She checked the surgical site. Clean, no signs of immediate complications. The incision was closed with neat, precise sutures. In different circumstances, it would have been a textbook appendectomy. In these circumstances, it was something else entirely. A violation in the service of healing, trauma inflicted to prevent death. Hartwell removed his surgical gloves and threw them in a waste bin. His hands were still shaking. He had performed hundreds of surgeries in his career, but none had felt like this. None had required causing such suffering to achieve success. Reeves lowered his camera. He had documented everything, the entire procedure, the context that would explain the controversial photograph of Tom tearing Yuki's kimono. But he felt changed by what he had witnessed. He had thought documentation was simple. Point the camera, press the button, record the truth. Now he understood that truth was complicated, that a single image could lie while a series of images told the story. That context was everything. Ellen cleaned Yuki's face with a damp cloth, wiping away sweat and tears. She spoke softly in Japanese. Gambata ne anata wa tsuyoi desu. You did well. You are strong. Yuki did not respond. She was unconscious, her body and mind retreating to recover from trauma. But she was alive. Against all odds, against limited resources, against the complications of war and the restrictions imposed by command, she was alive. Outside the medical tent, Tom stood with his back against a support post, breathing hard. Private Reeves found him there, looking pale and shaken. "Sergeant, are you okay?" Tom looked at him with eyes that held too much. "I just held down a woman while she was tortured. How am I supposed to be okay? You saved her life. Did I? Or did I just inflict suffering that she will never forget? How is she supposed to understand that we were helping when all she felt was pain?" Reeves did not have an answer. He was 21 years old and had been in the Pacific for less than a week. He did not have wisdom to offer, only documentation. "I photographed everything," Reeves said. "If anyone questions what happened, we have evidence, complete evidence, medical necessity, life-saving intervention." Tom's expression remained troubled despite Reeves's reassurance. He pulled out a cigarette and lit it with trembling hands. The smoke curled up into the Okinawa afternoon, dissipating in the heat. From the prisoner compound came sounds of distress. Japanese prisoners were still agitated, still uncertain about what had happened in the medical tent. Some were crying, others were shouting in anger. Tom heard them and felt the weight of misunderstanding. They thought he had done something terrible. They had heard a woman scream and fabric tear. They had drawn the obvious conclusion, and they were not entirely wrong. He had done something terrible. The fact that it was necessary did not make it less terrible. An elderly Japanese woman pushed her way to the fence. She shouted at Tom in Japanese, her voice full of accusation and pain. Tom could not understand the words, but he understood the meaning. Monster, murderer, violator. He did not defend himself. He simply stood there and accepted her condemnation. Because part of him believed she was right. The first 48 hours after surgery were critical. Yuki lay in the medical tent on a clean cot that Ellen had prepared covered with sheets that smelled of soap and sunlight. Her surgical site had been bandaged with careful precision, white gauze wrapped around her abdomen, like protection against the infection that could still claim her life even after the appendix had been removed. Fever was the enemy now. If her body temperature climbed too high, if infection took hold in the surgical wound, if bacteria spread through her bloodstream, then everything they had done would be for nothing. She would die anyway, only now she would die with the added trauma of surgery etched into her final days. Ellen Cooper checked on Yuki every 2 hours day and night. She monitored vital signs with the vigilance of someone who understood that medicine was not finished when the scalpel was put away. Temperature, pulse, respiratory rate, the appearance of the surgical wound. Each measurement told a story about whether Yuki's body was winning or losing the battle against infection. On the morning of June 16th, Yuki woke for the first time since the surgery. Her eyes opened slowly, struggling to focus in the filtered light of the medical tent. Pain radiated from her abdomen, sharp and insistent, but different from the pain before surgery. This was the pain of healing, not dying. Her body recognized the difference, even if her mind was still catching up. Ellen was there immediately, kneeling beside the cot with a cup of water. She helped Yuki sit up just enough to take small sips, supporting her head with practiced gentleness. The water was clean and cool, drawn from the purified American supply. It tasted better than anything Yuki had drunk in months. Yuki's throat was raw from screaming. She tried to speak but could only manage a whisper. Ellen did not need words. She checked Yuki's temperature with a thermometer under her tongue, counted her pulse at her wrist, examined the bandage for any signs of bleeding or discharge. The temperature reading showed 38.5 degrees Celsius. Elevated but not dangerously so. Normal for post-operative recovery. Ellen made a note in her medical log, recording the time and the measurement with the careful documentation that might someday protect them all from accusations. Yuki watched Ellen work with an expression that held confusion and something that might have been the beginning of trust. This woman had been there during the surgery, had held her hand, had spoken words in a language Yuki did not understand, but in a tone that communicated care. Now this same woman was monitoring her recovery with the attention of someone who genuinely wanted her to survive. It contradicted everything Yuki had been taught about Americans. They were supposed to be cruel, indifferent to suffering, willing to let prisoners die from neglect. But this woman, this enemy nurse, was treating Yuki with the same care she would give to one of her own soldiers. Ellen noticed Yuki watching her and offered a gentle smile. She spoke slowly in English, pointing to herself. Ellen. My name is Ellen. Yuki understood. She pointed to herself with a trembling hand. Yuki. Yuki, Ellen repeated, pronouncing it carefully. You are going to be okay, Yuki. You are going to heal. The words were in English, but the meaning transcended language. Yuki saw it in Ellen's eyes, genuine concern, professional competence, human compassion that recognized no boundaries of nationality or politics. For the first time since her capture, Yuki allowed herself to believe that she might actually survive this war. Throughout that first day, other members of the surgical team came to check on Yuki's recovery. Lieutenant Hartwell examined her wound in the afternoon, carefully peeling back the bandage to inspect the suture line. The incision was clean, showing no signs of infection. The sutures held firm. The surrounding skin was slightly inflamed, but that was normal. Expected. The body's natural response to trauma. Hartwell nodded with satisfaction. Healing well. Keep her on fluids today. Tomorrow we can try soft foods if the fever stays stable. He looked at Yuki and spoke slowly, hoping she might understand a few words. You are doing good. You are strong. Yuki did not fully understand his words, but she understood his tone. Professional, satisfied, relieved. The same tone her father had used when a patient was recovering well. The universal language of doctors who had fought death in one. That afternoon, Tom Bishop's patrol route took him past the medical tent. He had been avoiding it since the surgery, unable to face what he had done, unable to reconcile his actions with his understanding of himself as a decent man. But duty required him to patrol this section of camp, and he could not avoid it forever. He glanced through the open tent flap and saw Yuki awake, sitting up slightly with pillows behind her back. Their eyes met across the distance. Tom froze, every instinct telling him to look away, to keep walking, to avoid this confrontation with his own guilt. But Yuki did not look away. She held his gaze for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then slowly and with obvious effort, she inclined her head, a small gesture of acknowledgement. Just once, a small movement of her head that acknowledged his presence. Not forgiveness, not yet, but acknowledgement. Recognition that he had been there, that he had done something, that she was a woman and he was part of the reason why. Tom nodded back, a mirror of her gesture. Then he continued his patrol, his throat tight with emotions he did not have words for. That night, Yuki's fever spiked to 40 degrees Celsius. Ellen woke from her brief rest to find Yuki shaking with chills, her body trying to fight an infection that threatened to overwhelm her immune system. This was the crisis point, the moment when everything they had done could still fail. Ellen applied cool compresses to Yuki's forehead and called for Lieutenant Hartwell. He arrived within minutes, his hair disheveled from sleep, his medical bag in hand. He examined Yuki, quickly checking the surgical site again, looking for signs of spreading infection. The wound itself still looked clean. The infection was internal, invisible, the body's response to the trauma of surgery and the bacteria that had leaked from the gangrenous appendix before removal. Hartwell made a decision. She needs antibiotics, penicillin. It is the only thing that will stop this infection. Ellen's eyes met Hartwell's. They both understood what came next. Captain Crane had explicitly forbidden the use of antibiotics on prisoners. The limited supply was reserved for American soldiers. Using it on Yuki would be direct violation of orders. Hartwell stood up and prepared to go argue with Crane again. But Ellen stopped him with a hand on his arm. Let me check the supply cabinet first. Maybe we have more than we thought. She left the medical tent and walked through the dark camp to the supply building. The antibiotics were kept in a locked cabinet, carefully inventoried, each vial accounted for. But when Ellen opened the cabinet, she found something unexpected. A single vial of penicillin sat on her desk beside the cabinet, not inside where it should be, outside, available, and next to it a small piece of paper with unsigned words written in pencil. For the patient, do not ask where it came from. Ellen recognized the handwriting. She had seen Sergeant Bishop fill out supply requisition forms. She knew his careful block letters, the way he dotted his I's and crossed his T's with military precision. He had stolen this, broken into the medical supply cabinet, taken medication that was not his to take, and left it where it would be found and used. If discovered, he would face court-martial. Theft of military medical supplies was a serious offense, potentially resulting in dishonorable discharge or even imprisonment, but he had done it anyway, because he believed Yuki deserved to live. Ellen held the vial in her hand for a long moment, understanding the weight of the gift. Then she returned to the medical tent and administered the first dose of penicillin to Yuki, pushing the medication slowly through a makeshift IV line. She did not tell Hartwell where the antibiotics came from. She did not document their use in the official medical log. Some acts of mercy required silence to survive scrutiny. By morning, Yuki's fever had broken. Her temperature dropped to 37.8 degrees Celsius, nearly normal. The crisis had passed. The antibiotics had done their work, stopping the infection before it could spread beyond control. Ellen sat beside Yuki's cot, exhausted but relieved. She whispered a prayer of thanksgiving, her small Bible open in her lap. Yuki, more alert now, watched with fascination. She had seen Americans pray before, but she had never understood why they would pray for her. An enemy, a prisoner, someone their propaganda said they should hate. Over the next several days, Yuki's recovery progressed steadily. On June 18th, she was able to sit up without assistance. On June 19th, she took her first steps, walking slowly around the medical tent with Ellen supporting her elbow. On June 20th, she was strong enough to help with minor tasks, folding bandages and organizing supplies under Ellen's supervision. As her strength returned, Yuki began to observe the Americans more carefully. She watched how they interacted with each other, how they treated the prisoners, how they conducted themselves. She was looking for confirmation of the propaganda she had been taught, evidence that Americans were cruel, that their kindness was merely a facade, that beneath the surface they were the monsters she had been told to fear. But the evidence did not support the propaganda. Instead, she saw something different. She saw young men who were tired of war, who shared their rations with hungry prisoners, who tried to communicate with hand gestures and broken phrases, who treated the Japanese prisoners with a fundamental decency that suggested they saw them as human beings rather than enemies. She saw Sergeant Bishop leave a Japanese-English dictionary near her cot, placed carefully where she would find it. She saw Ellen bring her extra blankets when the nights grew cool. She saw Lieutenant Hartwell check on her recovery with the same careful attention he gave to American soldiers in the adjacent tent. And slowly, Yuki's understanding of the world began to shift. Not suddenly, not with a single revelation, but gradually, like watching the sun rise. The categories that had once seemed absolute became less certain. American and Japanese, enemy and ally, good and evil. The lines were not as clear as she had been taught. On June 21st, Ellen brought Yuki something unexpected. A bar of chocolate, American chocolate, Hershey's, the kind that American soldiers received in their ration packages, a small luxury that made military life slightly more bearable. Ellen broke the bar in half and offered a piece to Yuki. For you, you need to eat. Get strong. Yuki hesitated. In Japanese culture, accepting a gift created obligation. Accepting food from an enemy seemed like betrayal. But she was curious. She had never tasted American chocolate, and Ellen's face held such genuine kindness that refusing seemed wrong. Yuki accepted the chocolate and took a small bite. The taste was unlike anything she had experienced. Sweet, rich, smooth. Nothing like the bitter rations she had eaten in Japanese military camps. This was abundance made tangible. This was what Americans had, what they shared casually, what they gave to prisoners without thinking twice. Yuki's eyes widened with surprise, and Ellen laughed gently at her expression. Good, yes, American chocolate. Good, Yuki repeated in English, one of the few words she knew with certainty. Very good. That moment, small as it was, represented something larger. Yuki had been taught that Americans hoarded resources while letting others starve, that they were selfish and cruel. But here was an American nurse sharing her personal ration with an enemy prisoner, giving freely what she could have kept for herself. The propaganda had lied. And if it had lied about this, what else had it lied about? On June 22nd, a week after the surgery, Ellen arranged a meeting between Yuki and Sergeant Bishop. Yuki had requested it using the dictionary to communicate her wish. She wanted to thank the soldier who had torn her clothing. She needed him to understand that she knew now why he had done it. Tom was reluctant. He did not want to be thanked, did not want to be called a hero for doing something that still felt like violation no matter how necessary it had been. But Ellen insisted. She said Yuki needed this, that healing required more than physical recovery, that understanding needed to be voiced even across language barriers. So Tom came to the medical tent in the late afternoon when the heat was beginning to fade and the camp was settling into evening routines. Yuki was sitting on her cot, the Japanese-English dictionary in her lap, papers covered with carefully written English words spread around her. She had been preparing for this conversation. Tom stood near the tent entrance, uncertain how to proceed. Ellen brought a chair and placed it near Yuki's cot, gesturing for Tom to sit. Then she positioned herself nearby as informal translator, ready to help bridge the language gap. Yuki spoke first, carefully pronouncing English words she had practiced. Thank you. You help. You save. I alive because you. The words were grammatically imperfect, but emotionally clear. Tom felt his throat tighten. I am sorry I had to hurt you. Yuki consulted her dictionary, found the words she needed. I understand, was necessary, medical necessary. You choose right, you choose life. She placed her hand over her abdomen where the surgical scar was healing beneath bandages. I nurse. I know appendix. I know no surgery, I die. You make hard choice. You make right choice. Tom shook his head. I tore your clothing. I held you down while you screamed. How is that right? Ellen translated the sentiment into simpler English that Yuki could understand. Yuki considered for a moment, then spoke carefully. War make hard choice. You choose mercy over easy. You choose my life over comfort. This is good man. She pulled a photograph from her pocket, something she had salvaged from before the war. It showed her family. Her father in his physician's coat, her mother in traditional dress, her younger brother in a school uniform. All of them smiling. All of them dead now. My family gone. War take everything. But you give me life. You give me future. Maybe someday I have family again. Because you choose right. Tom looked at the photograph and saw echoes of his own family photo, the one he carried of his mother and sister. Different faces, different language, but the same fundamental human truth. People loved, people lost, people survived when others chose mercy over convenience. He pulled his own photograph from his pocket and showed it to Yuki. My family, Iowa, farm. Yuki looked at the image with interest. Beautiful. You go home someday. I hope so. And you? What will you do after the war? Yuki used her dictionary to construct her answer. I return Okinawa, find doctor school, help people, like my father, like you help me. You will be a good doctor, Tom said quietly. They sat in silence for a moment, two people from enemy nations connected by a moment of profound vulnerability and unexpected grace. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of understanding that transcended language. Finally, Yuki reached into a small bundle of her belongings and pulled out something she had made. An origami crane folded from a piece of scrap paper she had found in the camp. The folds were precise, despite the rough material. The crane's wings were spread as if in flight. She held it out to Tom. In Japan, crane mean hope, healing, peace. You give me life. I give you hope. Tom accepted the crane with careful hands, understanding that he was receiving something precious. A symbol, a promise, a connection that would endure beyond war. I will keep this, always. I will remember you. I remember you too. Never forget, you good man. Ellen, watching the exchange, felt tears in her eyes. This was why she had become a nurse, not for the glory or recognition, but for moments like this, when healing transcended the physical, when former enemies recognized their shared humanity, when war failed to destroy what was essential and good. The war in the Pacific ended on August 15, 1945, with Japan's unconditional surrender following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The news reached Camp Hansen via radio broadcast, and the American soldiers erupted in celebration. 3 years of brutal fighting in the Pacific. 3 years of watching friends die on hostile islands. Finally, it was over. They were going home. The Japanese prisoners received the news with different emotions: shock, shame, confusion, fear about what would happen to them now. Japan had never surrendered in its long history. The concept was foreign, unthinkable, and yet it had happened. The emperor himself had spoken on the radio, his voice breaking as he announced the unendurable. Yuki, now fully recovered from surgery, heard the announcement with mixed feelings. Relief that the killing would stop. Grief for her lost nation and lost family. Uncertainty about what came next. She had no home to return to. No family waiting for her. She was 24 years old and utterly alone in a world that had been turned upside down. But she was alive, and that fact, simple as it was, meant everything. Processing for prisoner repatriation began immediately. American authorities were eager to clear the camps to send Japanese nationals back to their homeland so occupation forces could focus on rebuilding rather than detention. Yuki was scheduled for transport in late August, along with hundreds of other Okinawan civilians. On August 19th, the day before her scheduled departure, Ellen arranged a final meeting between Yuki and the people who had saved her life. Lieutenant Hartwell, Sergeant Bishop, even Captain Crane, who had given grudging approval for the surgery, attended briefly. They gathered in the medical tent where everything had happened. The space looked different now, clean, organized. No longer the emergency operating theater it had been transformed into on that desperate June day. But the memories remained invisible, but powerful. Hartwell spoke first, addressing Yuki through Ellen's translation. You were a good patient, strong, brave. I am glad we could help you. Yuki bowed respectfully. You saved my life. I owe you everything. Hartwell shook his head. You owe us nothing. We did what doctors do. We treated someone who needed help. Captain Crane stood stiffly near the entrance, uncomfortable with the emotion in the room. But even he had been changed by what had happened. He had spent weeks watching Yuki recover, seeing her help Ellen in the medical tent, observing her gentle interactions with other patients. She was not the faceless enemy he had wanted her to be. She was a young woman with skills and dreams and a future that almost ended. He cleared his throat. Miss Nakamura, I approved your surgery under protest. I want you to know that. I did it because Lieutenant Hartwell gave me no choice. But I have watched your recovery. I have seen your character. And I am glad you survived. I hope you find peace in whatever comes next. It was the closest Crane could come to an apology, an acknowledgement that his rigid adherence to protocol had been wrong, that mercy mattered more than regulations, that individual lives were worth the resources required to save them. Yuki bowed deeply to Crane, understanding the significance of his words, even if the translation was incomplete. Then she turned to Tom, the man who had held her shoulders while she screamed, the man who had torn her clothing and violated her dignity to expose the infection that would have killed her, the man whose face had haunted her nightmares and her gratitude in equal measure. She approached him and extended her hand, Western style. Tom shook it, his large hand engulfing her small one. I go home tomorrow, Yuki said in careful English, but I never forget. You choose hard thing, you choose right thing, you good man, best man. Tom's eyes were wet. I will never forget you either. You taught me something important. What I teach? That being good sometimes means doing things that feel wrong, that mercy is not always gentle, that humanity survives even in war. Yuki smiled, understanding enough to grasp his meaning. Then she gave him the origami crane she had made, the paper bird that symbolized hope and healing. You keep, remember, someday maybe peace come, no more war, no more enemy, just people. Tom accepted the crane, holding it carefully in his calloused farmer's hands. I will keep this forever, I promise. They stood looking at each other for a final moment, two people whose lives had intersected for the briefest time, but whose impact on each other would last a lifetime. Then Yuki bowed, Tom bowed in return, and Ellen gently guided Yuki away to prepare for her departure. The next morning, Yuki climbed into the back of a military truck, along with dozens of other repatriated prisoners. She carried almost nothing, a small bundle of clothing, the damaged medical textbook, and hoped that somewhere in the ruins of Okinawa she might find a way to rebuild her life. As the truck pulled away from Camp Hansen, Yuki looked back one final time. She saw Sergeant Tom Bishop standing near the perimeter fence watching her leave. When their eyes met across the distance, she raised her hand in farewell. Tom raised his hand in response, holding the gesture until the truck turned a corner and she disappeared from sight. Tom stood there for a long time after she was gone, one hand in his pocket, where his mother's letter rested, the other holding the origami crane. The war was over. He would go home to Iowa in December. Back to his mother and sister and the farm. Back to the life he had left 3 years ago. But he would not be the same person who had left. The war had changed him in ways both terrible and profound. He had seen too much death, had caused too much suffering, even suffering in service of mercy. He carried ghosts that would never fully leave him. But he also carried this, the memory of choosing compassion when protocol demanded indifference, the knowledge that he had saved a life when it would have been easier to let it end, the understanding that being human meant making impossible choices and living with the consequences. The paper crane rested in his palm, its edges softened by time and handling. What had once been crisp folds were now gentle curves, the paper aged but intact, like hope itself, fragile but persistent. A reminder that sometimes the most heroic thing a person could do was choose mercy when everything else demanded cruelty. Tom Bishop returned to Iowa in December 1945, carrying his duffel bag and his memories in a small paper crane that he would keep in a wooden box for the rest of his life. He would marry Mary Sullivan in 1948. He would have 2 children. He would farm the land his grandfather had homesteaded. He would become a quiet, steady presence in his community, known for his gentleness and his reluctance to speak about the war. And every night before sleep, he would think about Yuki Nakamura, wonder if she had survived the chaos of post-war Japan, hope that she had achieved her dream of becoming a doctor, pray that she had found peace. He would never know for 33 years that she had attended Tokyo Medical School, that she had become one of Japan's most respected emergency physicians, that she had married and had children and built a life that honored the second chance he had helped give her. He would never know until 1978 when a historian discovered a photograph in a manila folder and started asking questions. A photograph that appeared to show something terrible, but actually captured something beautiful. A moment when humanity transcended hatred. A choice to save rather than destroy. A mercy cut that healed more than flesh. And when Tom Bishop, 60 years old and widowed, received a phone call from Dr. Margaret Fleming asking if he remembered June 15, 1945, he would find that he remembered everything. Every detail, every moment, every choice. And he would agree to meet Yuki Nakamura one more time, 33 years later, to discover what his mercy had created. To learn that the young nurse he had helped save had spent her life saving others. That the trauma he had inflicted had transformed into purpose. That the paper crane's promise of hope had been fulfilled beyond anything he could have imagined. But that reunion and all it would mean still lay decades in the future. For now, in December 1945, Tom Bishop simply went home to Iowa, to his mother's fried chicken and apple pie, to the farm and the cornfields, to the life he had fought to preserve. And in Tokyo, Yuki Nakamura began the long process of rebuilding, studying, healing, becoming the doctor her father had dreamed she would be, living the life that had almost ended on a stretcher in Okinawa, saved by enemies who chose to see her not as Japanese or American, not as prisoner or soldier, but simply as a patient who needed help, as a human being whose life mattered. And that, in the end, was the entire story. The only story that truly mattered. That in the midst of war's worst horrors, individual people could still choose compassion, could still recognize shared humanity, could still believe that every life, regardless of nationality or circumstance, deserved to be saved. The mercy cut had been deep, but what it revealed was deeper still. The capacity for goodness that persists even when everything conspires to destroy it. The stubborn human insistence that life matters, that healing is possible, that hope survives, even in war, especially in war, when it matters most.